So it seems like all kind of modern animated Bible adaptations exist at least somewhat in the shadow of the 1998 beloved classic, The Prince of Egypt. That film really was like a refreshing novelty amid a sea of less edifying animated Hollywood entertainment. But times have changed and faith-based entertainment is now thriving. Along with several like live action films and shows, Light of the World is already the second major animated Bible adaptation released this year, following Angel Studios' The King of Kings. The question is The Light of the World a worthy successor to the animated adaptations that have come before it? Or does it get lost in the suddenly crowded sea of Jesus adaptations? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I personally do think we will eventually reach like an oversaturation of Jesus films, but this film proves that we're not there quite yet, because I actually like this movie quite a bit. I think kind of brought to life with really beautiful 2D animation, Light of the World is a charming and like unapologetically evangelistic depiction of the gospel story, even as it does sort of navigate some of the similar problems as other Bible adaptations. For many Christians, I think the primary concern about a Bible adaptation is the actual like adapting of the Bible, and I think understandably so. But a visual adaptation like Light of the World is also fundamentally like a work of art, and I think that artistry is on full display here because this movie looks great. Under the guidance of accomplished animator Tom Bancroft, who is like a Disney veteran behind hits like The Lion King or Beauty and the Beast or Aladdin, I think several other classics, this film boasts a delightful sort of throwback 2D animation style that really does set it apart from like other Bible adaptations and even just other animated films in general. And perhaps I'm merely of like the proper age demographic to feel nostalgia for 2D animation, but I think there's just kind of a level of intimacy to the visuals that is perfectly suited for the subject matter, and I am 100% on board the bandwagon of wanting a revival of like 2D animation in Hollywood. The story itself tells the gospel primarily through the eyes of the disciple John, who is imagined in this film as being a young child. And many Bible scholars have theorized that John may indeed have been like the youngest of the disciples, although the fact that Jesus gives him charge of his mother Mary to like bring into his house suggests that he was almost certainly like more a young man than a child. But setting aside the question of like biblical accuracy, I do think the creative decision effectively gives like the film's target audience a relatable peer through like whose eyes they can witness the gospel story unfold. And I think the film is definitely at its best when the story is being filtered through John's perspective and just sort of his sense of childlike wonder. The problem is that it doesn't always stay committed to that approach. I think as with many other kind of Bible adaptations, the film does sometimes feel like it's merely checking off the chronological list of gospel events rather than exploring sort of John's personal experience of those events. And the film attempts to like address this by basically inserting John front and center of most of the key moments. Even so, after what I found to be, a very interesting and inventive first act, the movie more or less settles into a straightforward visualization of the gospel and does lose at least some of the earlier narrative framework and perspective that made the earlier scenes feel unique and fresh to me. As far as the adaptation process, there is no one size fits all approach, and I think different viewers will have different expectations and demands. To me, Light of the World is perhaps similar to a modernized Bible translation like The Message, kind of focusing on making the main ideas accessible to modern audiences. In fact, this may be the first Bible adaptation with a Jaws reference, which personally I thought was awesome. Overall though, I think the film does remain mostly faithful to the biblical text. There are some relatively inconsequential visual embellishments, such as during Christ's baptism or Peter walking on the water. And the film also invents some material to fill in the narrative gaps and to make John more integral to the story. For example, there's a subplot about unpaid taxes and John's father's impending imprisonment, or even some brief moments of manufactured action where guards are chasing after the disciples that are not found in the original scriptures. There are also some omissions or condensing of events to streamline the story, and most of these are understandable, such as having Jesus carry the cross himself instead of introducing an additional minor character in Simon. But perhaps the most striking omission is a diminished focus on the empty tomb, and it's a surprising decision given its obvious importance in the gospel story, but also being an event in which John, the film's protagonist, was present for in the Bible. And to be clear, it's not a huge issue, and you do see the empty tomb briefly. I just felt that by glossing over it, it does take away some of the dramatic weight of Christ's resurrection. And maybe it's just my own personal soapbox, but it's just odd to me that as Christians we put so much weight on the cross, and then arguably the more important event and symbol, the empty tomb, is often treated almost as an afterthought. But quibbles with some of the creative decisions aside, there is no denying this film's sort of evangelistic heart, because it begins with a title card displaying John 3:16, and then ends with a sort of altar call as the animated John and his father come on screen like a fourth wall breaking Dora the Explorer episode to encourage people to accept Jesus, as a QR code appears on screen that links to some first steps of becoming a Christian videos and resources. And I'll be honest, I'm not totally crazy about that ending, not only because I think the target audience likely can't actually use a QR code, but also because to me it just makes the film feel a bit more like a Sunday school lesson or like a visualized gospel track than being a work of art that trusts its own story. But I think regardless of my own personal preferences, I do commend the filmmaker's missional heart, and I can absolutely see this film being a valuable resource for the church. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, as you might expect, there's not a whole lot going on. Nothing for language, nothing for sexuality. For violence, you do sort of see some red streaks of blood that are visible both during the telling of the Good Samaritan parable, and then also during the crucifixion scene. And during the crucifixion, the nails are not shown actually piercing the hands or feet, but you do hear sort of Christ's agonizing screams. The only other kind of content stuff that I thought I would mention didn't personally bother me, but just a heads up that the film does use a sort of ripple effect to visualize Christ's power when he's performing miracles. And I think it is an effective visual cue for younger viewers, but I think it may strike some Christians as presenting Jesus more in a Gnostic sense, as a sort of magician. As far as themes, worldviews, things going on beneath the surface, obviously a main theme is merely the gospel itself, but there's also a repeated refrain throughout the film that says, God rarely shows up in the way we think he will. And much of the movie focuses on sort of the misguided expectations of John and the other disciples, because they sort of enthusiastically imagine Jesus as a Messiah who will establish an earthly kingdom and rule with might and power and unleash vengeance on their enemies and free them of Roman oppression. And these expectations are visualized in the disciples' hope for Palm Sunday, which shows Jesus riding in on a white stallion brandishing a sword, a very stark kind of contrast to the humble Messiah riding in on a donkey. I will say, obviously, biblical accuracy is not a problem, although I do wonder just a little bit how much younger viewers will grasp the political dynamics of the first century enough to be able to make more modern day applications. That being said, the film does offer some guidance in that area, such as a conversation between Jesus and John that uses some really striking imagery to give a more direct gospel presentation. And a closing monologue by John also effectively sort of summarizes the theme, in which he says of Jesus, he didn't come to conquer, he came to serve. He didn't come to defeat our enemies, he came to show us how to love them. He didn't come to condemn us in our darkness, but to fill us with his light and lead us back to God. I think the film just offers plenty of opportunities for parents to discuss with their children sort of the nature of Jesus and just the countercultural life he has called us to live. I should quickly add too that while the age of John in the film may not be entirely biblically accurate, I really love the dynamic of a child following as a disciple of Jesus, and I think it's just another powerful way to explore the film's central theme. And an ending scene in which John actually leads his father to pray and accept Christ as a savior is just a really beautiful moment, kind of elevating a child's faith and empowering younger viewers to follow Christ and set an example for older generations. And as a father myself of two young boys sort of close to the age of John in the film, I just really appreciated that. So in the end, I think Bible adaptations are always a little bit tricky to evaluate, since they do serve a very different purpose than other films, with a evangelistic component beyond mere entertainment value. I think ultimately each viewer will need to determine whether a good adaptation is one that accurately conveys Bible knowledge one for one, or else one that resonates with the broader heart of the gospel, even if it comes at the expense of some of the literal narrative details. For me, I enjoyed Light of the World for what it is, and I think watching it alongside one of my 10-year-old sons and just seeing the wonder in his eyes as the Bible came to life really reminded me what kind of matters most and what this is all about. I think this is a charming film, and I pray that other young viewers will also have their eyes open just to the goodness, truth, and beauty of the gospel. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you were really, impressed by what this film was doing, if you appreciated the 2D animation style, or maybe you took some issues with some of the minor changes to the source material, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Got lots of other movie reviews. Got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast. Got interviews. Just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.